You know how it is in a big city? Rent is a monster that's always hungry. For 2 months I've been feeding it pieces of my soul, crashing on a friend's couch and feeling my welcome shrink a little more each day. I was 23, fresh out of college with a degree that was proving to be about as useful as a screen door on a submarine, and working a dead-end data entry job that paid just enough to make me dream of being poor somewhere else. Every apartment listing was a sick joke, a cozy studio that was actually a converted closet, or a charming vintage walk-up that smelled like a century of boiled cabbage and despair. I was close to giving up, to packing it all in and crawling back to my parents' spare room 2 states away. And then I found it, the listing for the studio in the Cromwell building. The price was the first thing that caught my eye. It wasn't just low, it was suspicious. It was the kind of rent you'd expect to pay in a small town a decade ago, not in the heart of this sprawling metropolis. The pictures were grainy, but they showed a decent-sized room with a big window, a small kitchenette tucked into a nook, and a separate bathroom. No obvious bloodstains or structural damage. I called the numbers so fast I think I bruised my thumb on the screen. The building itself was, well, vintage was a kind word. It was a solid 9-story brick behemoth from the 40s or 50s, squeezed between a laundromat and a check-cashing place. It had seen better days. The mortar was crumbling in places and the grand-looking entryway arch was stained with years of city grime. But it was standing. It was a roof. The super met me out front, Mr. Henderson. He was a tall, bony man who looked like he'd been carved out of old wood and left in the rain. His face was a roadmap of scowls, and his gray janitor's jumpsuit was splattered with what I hoped was grease. He didn't smile or offer a hand. He just grunted my name, more a question than a greeting, and jangled a mess of keys. 6th floor, he said, his voice a low rumble like gravel being dragged across concrete. Elevator's a piece of junk. Take the stairs. The lobby was dark. The one light fixture overhead was missing 2 of its 3 bulbs, casting long, dancing shadows. The air was thick with the smell of dust, cheap disinfectant, and something else, something faintly metallic and musty, like old coins. We trudged up the stairs. The concrete steps were worn into shallow bowls in the middle, and the only sound was our footsteps and my own increasingly heavy breathing. The hallways on each floor were long and dim, lined with identical brown doors. I saw no one, heard nothing. It was eerily quiet for a building that had to have housed dozens of people. But then he opened the door to 6B, and a wave of relief washed over me. The apartment was exactly what the ad promised. More, even. It was clean, spotless actually. The wood floors shone. The single large window let in a surprising amount of afternoon light, and the kitchenette, though tiny, had new-looking fixtures. It was small, a perfect little box for one person to start a life in. "It's perfect," I breathed, the words coming out before I could stop them. I was trying to play it cool, not seem too desperate. Mr. Henderson just grunted again, leaning against the doorframe. "Lease is 1 year, first and last month's rent up front. No pets. No loud parties." "Done, I'll take it," I said, my heart thumping with victory. I had done it. I had found my place. He didn't seem to share my excitement. He just stared at me for a long moment, his eyes dark and unreadable. It was an unnerving gaze, like he was sizing up a piece of meat. "You're young," he stated, as if it were an accusation. Yeah, 23. He nodded slowly, a deep line forming between his eyebrows. "All right, come down to the office. Sign the papers." The office was a cramped, windowless room in the basement that smelled of mildew and stale cigarette smoke. The signing was quick and impersonal. He slid the papers across his cluttered metal desk. I signed my name, and pushed over a cashier's check that represented nearly everything I had in the world. He took it without a word, folded it, and put it in his pocket. For a moment I thought that was it, but then he reached into a drawer and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a piece of cheap copy paper, yellowed at the edges, and covered in text from an old-fashioned typewriter. The letters were slightly uneven, some darker than others. It was titled, simply, Building Rules. "You read this," he said. He wasn't handing it to me, he was presenting it, like a verdict. His voice had lost its gravelly indifference, and taken on a new, sharp edge. A seriousness that felt entirely out of place. "These aren't suggestions, kid. You live here. You respect the rules. You respect them completely, you understand?" "Yeah, sure, of course," I said, taking the sheet. His fingers were cold and dry. I glanced down at it as he retrieved my key. "Building rules. 1. Do not look out the windows after 11 p.m., not for any reason. 2. If you hear classical music, symphonic, turn your television on. Volume to maximum. Do it immediately. 3. The elevator is not to be used between midnight and 6 a.m. Always take the stairs. 4. Never accept food from a neighbor after sundown. Politely decline. 5. If you find a small carved wooden toy outside your door, leave it. Do not bring it inside. It will be gone by morning. 6. Securely lock your door at all times. This is not a suggestion. I had to physically stop myself from laughing out loud. This had to be a joke. Some kind of elaborate, weirdo prank that the building management was in on. Rule number 1? Was there a peeping Tom landlord? Rule number 2 was even better. Maybe the walls were paper thin and someone hated Beethoven. And wooden toys? It was absurd. I looked up at Mr. Henderson, a smirk playing on my lips. Is this for real? The look on his face wiped the smile right off mine. There was no humor in his eyes. None at all. Just a flat, weary intensity. He pushed the key for 6B across the desk. It was an old, heavy, skeleton-style key. I don't make the rules, he said, his voice low and final. I just make sure people have a chance to follow them. Don't be stupid, kid. And that was it. He stood up, indicating our business was over. I walked out of that basement office feeling strange. The initial thrill of getting the apartment was still there, but it was now coated with a thin film of unease. The man's seriousness was deeply unsettling. Back in my new, empty apartment, I dropped my bag and the unsettling rule sheet on the floor. The sunlight was starting to fade, painting the bare walls in shades of orange and pink. It was beautiful, my own space, my own little corner of the world. I picked up the paper again and reread it, this time letting myself chuckle. It was probably some relic from a bygone era, written by an eccentric first owner decades ago. And now it was just a funny quirk of the building. A story to tell my friends. You won't believe the list of rules my new landlord gave me, I'd say. We'd all have a good laugh. The rule about the TV was probably just a passive-aggressive way to deal with noise complaints from a tenant who liked their symphonies a little too loud. The one about the windows? Maybe there was a bat problem years ago. You could find a rational, boring explanation for any of them if you tried hard enough. I folded the paper and tossed it onto the kitchen counter, next to where my microwave would go. I had boxes to unpack, a life to start. I walked over to the large window and looked down at the street 6 floors below. The city was coming alive for the night, headlights streaking past, the ambient hum rising. It was all mine to watch. What a strange place, I thought to myself, a genuine, happy smile spreading across my face. But it's home now. I felt a sense of peace, of solid, earned privacy, locked away in my own little sanctuary, high above the world. I had no idea, of course. No idea that the piece of paper I'd just dismissed was the most important thing I now owned. And I had no idea that my new, cherished privacy was an illusion, one that was already being watched and waiting. The first few days were, honestly, pretty great. You know how it is when you finally get your own place. Every little thing feels like a major victory. Buying a cheap shower curtain and hanging it up felt like I was renovating a palace. Unpacking my 2 boxes of books and arranging them on the deep windowsill felt like I was curating a library. I'd cook myself sad little meals of instant noodles and a fried egg in my kitchenette, and I'd eat it sitting on the floor, looking around at my kingdom of bare walls and feeling like a king. It was mine. The silence was mine. The space was mine. The freedom was absolute. My job was the kind of soul-crushing data entry that makes you question capitalism on an hourly basis, but having this apartment to come back to made it bearable. It was a refuge. I'd trudge up the 6 flights of stairs, tired and smelling like the city bus, and the moment I turned that heavy old key in the lock and stepped inside, the world outside would just melt away. The hallway was always quiet, unnervingly so, and I rarely saw my neighbors. I'd catch a glimpse of a door closing down the hall, or hear the faint sound of a TV through a wall, but that was it. They were just nameless shapes, ghosts in the same machine I was in. It suited me fine. I wasn't there to make friends, I was there to survive. The list of rules Mr. Henderson had given me ended up tucked under a stack of junk mail on the kitchenette counter. A couple of times, my eyes would land on the typewritten letters, and I'd let out a little snort. Building rules. It was so serious, so dramatic. It became a private joke. When I'd lock my door at night, which I did anyway because I'm not an idiot, I'd think, there, following rule number 6, Mr. Henderson, don't want to get in trouble. It was a funny little quirk of a strange old building. Nothing more. My life fell into a simple, predictable rhythm. Work, stairs, ramen, sleep, repeat. It was on a Thursday, maybe 4 or 5 days after I moved in, that the rhythm broke. The workload had been insane, a server migration or some other corporate jargon I didn't care about, and I didn't get to leave the office until well after 10. The bus ride was long. The city at that hour is a different beast. Emptier, quieter, but somehow more menacing. The usual crowds are gone, replaced by solitary figures moving through pools of light and shadow. By the time I climbed that final flight of stairs and got into my apartment, my legs were aching and my brain felt like a sponge full of static. The clock on my phone read 11:27 p.m. I dropped my bag on the floor with a heavy thud, kicked off my shoes and flopped onto the second-hand armchair I'd bought online. It was the only real piece of furniture I had besides my mattress on the floor. I just sat there for a few minutes, soaking in the silence, letting the tension of the day drain out of me. The apartment was dark, lit only by the faint orange glow of the streetlights filtering through the thin curtains. It was peaceful. My gaze drifted to the kitchenette counter. The yellowed paper was still there, peeking out from under a pizza coupon. I sighed, pushed myself up and walked over to it. I picked it up, the cheap paper feeling flimsy in my hands. Building rules. I read them again, a tired, cynical smile on my face. 1. Do not look out the windows after 11 p.m. Not for any reason. 11:27. I was already past the curfew. A little spark of defiance, fueled by exhaustion and a general feeling of being fed up with the world, flickered inside me. What a ridiculous, arbitrary rule. Why not? What was going to happen? Was Mr. Henderson going to rappel down from the roof and write me a ticket? Was I going to see a couple making out in a car and be scandalized? The thought was so absurd it made me want to do it. Just to prove a point to a universe that wasn't listening. It wasn't even a big decision. It was an impulse. A tiny rebellion against a piece of paper. You know the feeling. The same one that makes you press a button that says do not press. I walked over to the large window. The cheap polyester curtain felt cool against my fingers. For a second, a flicker of Henderson's dead serious face flashed in my mind. Don't be stupid, kid. I almost hesitated. But then the feeling was gone, replaced by the simple logic of a 23-year-old who thinks he knows everything. It's my window. I pay rent. I can look out of my own damn window. So I did. I pulled the edge of the curtain back just an inch, making a narrow slit to peer through. The street below was completely deserted. It was almost a movie set of a lonely city street. The laundromat and the check-cashing place were dark, their metal security gates pulled down. The weak, yellow-orange lamps cast long, distorted shadows from trash cans and a lone skeletal-looking tree on the opposite side of the road. There were no cars parked along the curb. No stray cats. Nothing. The silence was absolute. I couldn't even hear the distant hum of traffic you usually get in a city this size. It was just empty. I remember thinking, well, that was anticlimactic. And then I saw it. Underneath the bare branches of that single tree, directly across the street, stood a person. No, not a person. A shape. A silhouette, made stark by the streetlight behind it. It was completely, utterly still. My first thought was that it was a strange shadow, a trick of the light, but the longer I looked, the more defined its human form became. It was wearing dark clothing, impossible to make out any details. It wasn't leaning against the tree. It wasn't looking at its phone. It was just standing there, in the middle of the sidewalk. A prickle of unease ran up my arm, the kind you get when something is just off. The posture was wrong. The figure was standing ramrod straight, with its head tilted back, looking up. Not at my window, specifically. It was a general, sweeping gaze aimed at the entire facade of the Cromwell building, like someone studying a map or admiring architecture. But no one admires the architecture of a grimy, 9-story brick box at almost midnight on a Thursday. I kept watching, my heart starting to beat a little faster. It didn't move. Not a twitch. Not a shift in weight. Just this silent, motionless observation. A full minute passed. The stillness was what was so terrifying. It was unnatural. People fidget. They check their watches. They shiver in the night air. This thing did none of that. It was as still as the lamppost beside it. My mind raced, trying to find a normal explanation. Okay, it's just someone waiting for a ride. An Uber maybe. But there were no headlights, no sign of an approaching car. Maybe they're drunk or high, but drunks sway. High people, will they do something? This was different. This was purposeful stillness. A cold dread began to seep into my bones. This wasn't right. The rule on the paper wasn't a joke. It wasn't a quirk. It was a warning. And I had just broken it. I felt a sudden, sharp spike of exposure, as if the thin glass and the 6 stories of air between us meant nothing. The feeling was primal. It was the feeling of a mouse realizing the shadow passing overhead is not a cloud but a hawk. I should have let go of the curtain then. I should have backed away and never looked back. But I was frozen, mesmerized by the sheer wrongness of the scene below. The figure's head, still tilted back, seemed to be scanning the floors. Up, then down. Slowly. Methodically. It wasn't looking for anyone in particular. It was just taking inventory. That was somehow worse. If it had been staring directly at my window, it would have been terrifying. But personal. This felt cold. Clinical. Like I wasn't a person, just a data point. Unit 6B. Light off. Inhabitant present. My breath hitched in my throat. I had to get away from the window. With a surge of adrenaline, I snatched my hand back from the curtain as if it were on fire. The fabric fell back into place, plunging my corner of the room back into shadow. But I could still see the image printed on the back of my eyelids, the empty street, the sickly yellow light, and the static shadow of a person standing watch. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I backed away from the window slowly, my eyes wide in the dark, my ears straining. I expected to hear something. A shout. A sound. Anything. But there was only the sound of my own ragged breathing filling the small apartment. Get a grip, I whispered to myself, the words feeling clumsy and loud in the silence. It's just a person, a weirdo. This city is full of weirdos. I repeated it to myself, a mantra against the rising tide of fear. It's just a weirdo. You're tired. Your mind is playing tricks on you. There is a rational explanation. You live in a big city now. Strange things happen. I forced myself to walk to the kitchenette, my movements stiff and jerky. I turned on the small faucet, the splash of water sounding like a roar. I filled a glass and drank it down in 3 huge gulps, the cold water doing little to calm the fire in my chest. I didn't dare look back toward the window. I didn't want to know if the sliver of light at the bottom of the curtain was still blocked by a pair of unseen feet. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I told myself I was being stupid. I was an adult. I wasn't afraid of the dark. I wasn't afraid of some random lunatic on the street. I was just spooked. I went to my mattress on the floor, pulled the blanket up to my chin, and forced my eyes shut, determined to sleep. Determined to forget the whole thing. But as I lay there in the oppressive silence of my new home, I couldn't shake the feeling of being seen, of being noted. Down on the street, hidden by the night and the distance, the figure remained motionless for another long moment. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, its head lowered from its survey of the building. In the deep shadow cast by the tree, unseen by the boy in apartment 6B, who was now desperately trying to convince himself it was all his imagination, the figure gave a single deliberate nod, as if a question had just been answered, as if a selection had just been made. For a couple of days nothing happened. And when nothing happens, your brain does this funny little thing where it rewrites history for you. The man under the tree wasn't a man, he was a shadow. The rule wasn't a warning, it was a coincidence. I wasn't scared, I was just tired. You know how it is. You build a story you can live with, because the alternative is admitting that you've made a terrible mistake by signing a lease for a place that might actually be trying to kill you. So I told myself the normal story. I went to work, I climbed the stairs, I ate my sad ramen, I slept. The rhythm came back, and I let it. It felt safe. It was a Sunday night. I didn't have work the next day, so I was staying up a little later, just scrolling through my phone, lying on the mattress. The apartment was dead quiet. The whole building was. It was that deep, heavy silence of a place where everyone is either asleep or just too tired to make a sound. It was almost 1 a.m, and then I heard it. It started so softly I thought I was imagining it. A sound that didn't belong. It was music. Classical music. A symphony of some kind. With violins soaring over these deep, melancholic cellos. It was beautiful, actually. But it was wrong. It was like finding a perfect, blooming rose in the middle of a dumpster. The sound wasn't coming from outside. or from above or below. It was seeping through the wall. The wall I shared with the apartment next door, 6C. The one where that girl lived. I'd never spoken to her, just seen her once or twice in the hall. Young, like me. Always had headphones on. The music was faint, but it was clear. A high-quality recording, not some tinny radio. My first thought was just annoyance. Really? 1 in the morning? But then, a cold little stone dropped in my stomach. I sat up, straining to listen. The yellowed paper on the counter flashed in my mind. What was it? Rule number 4? 4. If you hear classical music, turn your TV on. As loud as it will go, do not turn it off until sunrise. I remember staring at the wall, listening to the violins. The rule seemed so stupid, so utterly pointless. Turn my TV on? Why? So my sound would drown out her sound? It felt like some passive-aggressive boomer logic solution to a noise complaint. A way for the old tenants to wage war on each other without ever having to speak. I wasn't going to participate in that. Besides, the music wasn't even that loud. It was barely a whisper. Banging on the wall or blasting my TV seemed like a massive overreaction. So I did what any normal person would do. I found my earbuds, plugged them into my phone, and put on a podcast. I just wanted to sleep. I turned the volume up just enough to drown out the symphony and laid back down, closing my eyes. Problem solved. I was the bigger person. I was the smart one. I must have started to drift off, because the voices from the podcast were starting to blur into nonsense. I was in that soft, warm place right between awake and asleep, and through a gap in the podcast chatter I heard another sound. It came from the same direction, from apartment 6C. It wasn't music. It was a single, sharp, yet muffled noise. Thud. It's hard to describe. It was a dry, heavy sound. Not a crash, like something falling off a shelf. It was dense, like a heavy sandbag being dropped on a wooden floor, or a side of beef hitting a butcher's block. There was a finality to it. It was a sound that stopped, with no echo, no reverb. Just thud. And then, nothing. I pulled my earbuds out. My heart was suddenly beating a little too fast. The silence was absolute. The symphony was gone. My own apartment was quiet. I held my breath, listening, my ears straining so hard it felt like they were going to pop. Nothing. Not a footstep, not a cough, not a TV. The building had returned to its deep, dead stillness. "Hello?" I said, my voice a weak croak. It sounded pathetic, swallowed up by the silence. No answer. My mind started racing again, trying to build that normal story. She dropped something heavy. A box of books. A piece of furniture she was trying to move. Yeah, that's it. It's 1 in the morning. She's trying to be quiet. She drops a box. It makes a thud. And she turned her music off out of embarrassment. It was perfectly logical. It had to be. I lay there for another 10 minutes, maybe more, just listening. The silence was starting to feel heavy, oppressive. It felt louder than the music had. But nothing else happened. Eventually, exhaustion won. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the weirdness of this place was getting to me. I rolled over, and, after what felt like an hour, I fell into a restless, dreamless sleep. The next morning, the sun was streaming in, and the fear of the night felt distant and silly. See? I told myself. Nothing. You're fine. The world is normal. I got up, took a quick shower, and got dressed for work. I was running a little late, so I practically flew out of my apartment, locking the door behind me. And then I saw it. I froze, my hand still on my key. The door to 6C, my neighbor's door, was closed. But stretched across it, from the frame to the door itself, were 2 wide strips of yellow police tape. Police line, do not cross. The blocky, black letters seemed to scream in the dim, quiet hallway. Underneath the tape, stuck to the center of the door, was an official-looking piece of paper. A notice of seizure. My blood went cold. It felt like the floor had just dropped out from under me. The normal story I had so carefully constructed overnight just shattered into a million pieces. The music. The thud. The silence. It wasn't a box of books. My legs felt like they were made of lead as I walked toward the stairwell. Mr. Henderson, the superintendent, was there, sweeping the landing with a grim, methodical rhythm. He was the only other person in the hallway. Mr. Henderson. My voice didn't sound like my own. What happened? He didn't look up at me. He just kept sweeping, his eyes fixed on the small pile of dust he was corralling. Nothing for you to worry about. But the police tape? Is she okay? The girl in 6C? He stopped sweeping. He leaned on his broom and finally, slowly, lifted his head. His face was a mask of tired resignation. There was no surprise, no concern, just a deep, weary exhaustion, as if he'd had this exact conversation 100 times before. She moved out, he said, his voice flat. Family emergency. Had to leave in a hurry. The lie was so blatant, so lazy it was insulting. Moved out? Mr. Henderson, there's police tape on her door. Cops don't put up tape for a family emergency. He looked at me then, really looked at me for the first time. His eyes were dark and hollow. He wasn't looking at me like a tenant. He was looking at me like I was a problem, a loose end. Look, kid, he said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly whisper. You pay your rent on time. You keep to yourself. Don't go looking for things that ain't your business. It's better that way. For everyone. He gave me one last, hard look, then went back to his sweeping. The conversation was over. I stood there for a second, stunned. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. As I turned to go down the stairs, I passed one of the other doors on the floor. 6A. An old woman lived there, I think. The door was open just a crack, and I saw an eye watching me from the darkness inside. As soon as I met its gaze, the door clicked shut. Further down the hall, a man was just about to leave his apartment. He saw me looking at the taped door of 6C, and his face changed. It was the most bizarre expression I'd ever seen. It was pity, for sure. The kind of look you give a stray dog that's about to walk into traffic. But there was something else mixed in with it. Something harder. It was blame. Reproach. As if what happened to the girl in 6C was somehow my fault. He didn't say a word. He just shook his head, a tiny, almost imperceptible gesture, and hurried towards the stairs, his eyes fixed on the ground. I didn't go to work. I couldn't. I stumbled back to my apartment, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the lock. I slammed the door behind me and threw the deadbolt. The click of the lock sounded small and useless. I was breathing hard, pacing the tiny studio apartment like a caged animal. What the hell was happening? Moved out? Family emergency? No, a dry heavy thud isn't a family emergency. Police tape isn't a moving company. The looks. That's what I couldn't shake. That look of pity and blame. Why? What did I do? I didn't even know her. My eyes landed on the kitchenette counter, on the stack of junk mail, and peeking out from underneath it, the yellowed, typewritten sheet of paper. My heart hammered against my ribs. I walked over, my movements stiff, and pulled it out. The paper felt heavy, like a stone tablet. I smoothed it out on the counter, my fingers trembling. Building rules. I read them again. They weren't funny anymore. They weren't quaint, they were commandments. Each one was a tombstone. 1. Do not look out the windows after 11 p.m., not for any reason. 2. If you hear a knock on your door in a pattern of 3, ignore it. 3. Always lock your door from the inside. Not just at night, always. My eyes scanned down the list, my breath catching in my throat. 4. If you hear classical music, turn your TV on, as loud as it will go. I hadn't done it. I heard the music, and I hadn't done it. I put on my stupid headphones. I was clever. I was the bigger person. And the woman next door. Is that what the look was about? Did they somehow know? Did they know I heard it and did nothing? Was I supposed to save her? Was the TV a warning system? An alarm? Bigapuramau. My mind was screaming. I felt a surge of guilt so powerful it made me nauseous. But beneath the guilt, a new, colder, and sharper fear was taking root. It wasn't about her. Not entirely. The look from the neighbor wasn't just, you let her die. It was, you're next. I had broken a rule. I had failed a test. And now they knew it. What did I do wrong? I whispered to the empty room. What did I do? And then I remembered. It wasn't just last night. The chain of events didn't start with the music. It started days ago. It started with a flicker of defiance, a stupid, impulsive need to prove a point to no one. My gaze drifted to the big window, the cheap curtain looking like a funeral shroud. Rule number 1. Do not look out the windows after 11 p.m. I had looked. I had stood right there and pulled back the curtain. I had seen the empty street. I had seen the figure under the tree. The observer, the one who was taking inventory. A horrifying realization dawned on me, so clear and so cold it stopped my heart. The music last night, it wasn't for her. She was just the closest. She was the one who didn't have her TV on. She was the collateral damage. The music was for me. It was a test. And I had failed. They knew I was home. They knew I was listening. And they knew I wouldn't follow the rules. The figure under the tree wasn't just taking inventory. It had been looking for someone exactly like me. Someone new. Someone who didn't know the rules. Someone who had already proven they were willing to look. I didn't sleep. That's probably not a surprise. Sleep wasn't even on the menu anymore. After I locked the door, I just stood there in the middle of my tiny studio, my back to the door, listening. The realization about the man under the tree, the observer, hadn't just scared me. It had rewired my brain. The apartment wasn't a place to live anymore. It was a box, a trap, and I had been marked. Every sound in the building became a threat. The hum of the refrigerator wasn't a hum, it was a low growl, waiting. The groan of the pipes in the wall wasn't plumbing, it was the building shifting, settling, getting ready. I could hear the faint murmur of a television from the apartment below, and the sound, so normal just yesterday, now seemed like a desperate attempt by someone else to stay alive. To follow the rules. The sun went down. I didn't turn on a light. The darkness felt safer, like I was less of a target if I was just another shadow. I sat on the edge of the mattress, which I dragged away from the window and into the corner furthest from the door. I just sat for hours. My phone was in my pocket, a dead weight. Who would I call? The police? And say what? There's a set of weird rules, and I think I'm in trouble because I looked out a window and didn't turn on my TV. They'd think I was a crank. A psycho. Just another lonely guy losing his mind in a big city. My brain kept replaying it. The music. The thud. The police tape. The neighbor's look of pity and blame. He hadn't just been looking at me like I was next. He was looking at me like I had been careless. Like I had spilled something that was now staining the whole floor, and everyone else would have to be careful not to step in it. Because I broke the rules, the thing was now active. It was sniffing around our floor, and it was my fault. I put on my headphones. I was clever. I was the bigger person, and that girl paid for it. That thought was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. It was probably just after midnight when it started. Just like before, it was music. Classical. The same kind of rich, complex symphony full of sorrowful strings and deep, powerful brass. But this time was different. It wasn't faint. It wasn't seeping through a wall from next door. It was in the hallway. It was so clear, so crisp, it was as if someone had placed a high-fidelity speaker right outside my door. There was no distortion, no echo from the narrow corridor. It was a pure, direct sound, aimed right at me. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, elegant and sad. And it was the most terrifying sound I had ever heard in my life, because I knew, with a certainty that turned my blood to ice, that this performance was just for me. This was the overture. The yellowed paper. My mind screamed the words, "If you hear classical music, turn your TV on. As loud as it will go." Panic. It was a pure, animal panic that seized every muscle in my body. For a second, I was completely frozen, a statue in the dark, listening to the violins swell. Then, adrenaline hit me like a truck. I scrambled off the mattress, stumbling over my own feet in the pitch black. The TV. I needed the TV. Where was the remote? I never used the damn thing. It was a cheap, second-hand set the landlord had left behind. I patted the floor, my hands shaking so violently I could barely feel what I was touching. My fingers brushed against a shoe, a book, the cold metal leg of the small table. Not there. I crawled towards the kitchenette, my breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. The music from the hallway seemed to get louder, more insistent, the cellos vibrating through the floorboards. My hand finally closed around it, a smooth plastic rectangle half buried under a stack of junk mail on the counter. The remote. I felt a surge of hysterical relief, as if I'd just found the key to my own salvation. I scrambled back to the TV, pointing the remote with a trembling hand. I pushed the power button. Nothing. My fingers slipped. I pushed it again, harder, jamming it down. The screen flickered to life, bathing the room in a sudden, blinding blue light. I squinted, my eyes watering. A commercial for a pickup truck. It was loud, but it wasn't enough. Rule number 4. As loud as it will go. I found the volume up button and held it down. The soundbar on the screen started to fill up, block by block. The truck commercial gave way to the opening theme of a game show. Cymbals crashed, a fake crowd cheered, a man with teeth too white and a voice too loud screamed, "WHO wants to win $1 million?" The sound was obscene. It was a physical assault. The little speakers on the cheap TV distorted, cracking and buzzing with the sheer volume. But I didn't stop. I kept my thumb pressed down until the volume bar hit 100 and wouldn't go any higher. The sound was a tidal wave, a wall of meaningless, cheerful noise that filled every inch of the tiny apartment. It was so loud it hurt my ears, so loud I could feel the vibrations in my teeth. I dropped the remote and stumbled backwards, away from the screen until my back hit the wall. I slid down to the floor, wrapping my arms around my knees, making myself as small as possible. My heart was a frantic drum, beating against my ribs, a rhythm of pure terror trying to compete with the game show's theme music. I stared at the door. The thick wooden door with the deadbolt I had thrown earlier. The music in the hallway had stopped. Or maybe it was still there, but just completely drowned out by the noise. I couldn't tell. This was it, right? This was the counterspell. The signal. I was telling it. Telling the whole godforsaken building, I'm awake, I hear you. I'm following the rules now. Leave me alone. The game show host was introducing the first contestant, a smiling woman from Ohio. The studio audience applauded wildly. A bell dinged. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying. Please let this be enough. Please just go away. Go find someone else. Someone who isn't listening. The TV blared on. A minute passed. Then another. My breathing started to slow down. Just a little. The panic was still there. A cold knot in my stomach. But the immediate, heart-stopping terror began to recede. Maybe it worked. Maybe this insane, nonsensical ritual was all it took. Maybe I was safe. And then I heard it. It was a sound so quiet, so different from the chaos of the TV, that at first, my brain didn't even process it. It was a sound that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't at the door, it was at the window. A soft, dry, scratching sound. Scrape. My blood went cold all over again. I stopped breathing. It wasn't possible. I was on the 6th floor. There was no fire escape on this side of the building. There was nothing out there but a 60-foot drop to the pavement. The game show host asked a trivia question about state capitals. A buzzer sounded. The contestant answered, Boise. The audience cheered. Scrape. Tick, tick, scrape. It was a slow, deliberate sound, not the frantic scrabbling of an animal. It was patient. Exploratory. It was the sound of a single fingernail, or something like it, being dragged slowly across the glass pane. It moved from one side of the window to the other, a long, drawn-out stroke, followed by a few light, inquisitive taps. I stared at the thin, cheap curtain that covered the window, my whole body rigid with a new, more profound level of fear. The noise from the TV was just background static now. A meaningless distraction. The only sound in the universe was that gentle, persistent scratching from the other side of the glass. It knew. That was the only thought that my paralyzed mind could form. It knew I was in here. The TV wasn't a deterrent. It was a dinner bell. It had announced my location, confirmed I was home and awake. And the thing from outside, the thing that had been summoned by the music, hadn't been tricked. It hadn't been scared away. It had just walked around to the other side of the box. The observer I saw from this very window, the thing under the tree, it hadn't forgotten. It wasn't just looking for someone. It had been looking for me. My eyes were glued to the curtain. I could almost see the fabric ripple with the vibrations of the scratching. My imagination, wild with terror, painted a picture of what was on the other side. A face, pale and distorted, pressed against the glass. Long, spindly fingers with dirty, broken nails tapping, testing, searching for a weakness. The host on the TV was laughing. The audience was laughing with him. It was a sound from another world. A planet where people worried about money and trivia questions, not about what was clinging to the side of a building on the 6th floor. The scratching stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. I held my breath, my ears straining, listening for a footstep, a whisper, anything, but there was nothing but the idiotic cheerfulness of the game show. Had it gone? Did it give up? A new sound started. It was quieter than the scratching. It was a faint, metallic clicking, a precise, rhythmic sound. Click. Latch. Click. It was the sound of the window lock, the little metal latch on the inside of the frame. It was being jiggled, gently at first, then with more force. Something thin had been slipped through the tiny gap between the window and the frame, and it was now working on the latch. My heart didn't just drop, it ceased to exist. This wasn't a monster. This wasn't a ghost. This was an intelligent, methodical creature that understood how locks worked. It had tried the door. I had been ready. So it came to the window. It had seen me look out days ago. It knew I was here. It knew where I slept. And now, it was simply letting itself in. The TV host yelled, "That's the right answer. You've just won $5,000. The crowd went wild. The celebratory music swelled, a triumphant cascade of synthesized trumpets. And through that wall of triumphant noise, I heard the distinct, final, metallic snap as the window lock gave way. That was it. The sound. The final, metallic snap of the window lock giving way. It was a small noise, almost lost in the idiotic cheerfulness blaring from the television. But to me, it was as loud as a gunshot. It was a sound of finality. A sound of entry. For a second that stretched into an eternity, my body was no longer mine. It was just a statue carved from ice, locked in place against the far wall. My lungs had forgotten how to draw air. My heart, which had been a frantic rabbit, was now a single, solid stone in my chest. I stared at the thin curtain. Now, the only barrier between myself and whatever had just defeated the lock. The game show host on the TV was telling the contestant from Ohio that she'd have to risk her $5,000 to go for 10. It was the most absurd, insane thing I had ever heard. The world had split into two realities. There was the television world, full of lights and money and applause, and then there was this room, this dark, cold box, where the rules of physics and reason were being peeled away, layer by layer. And then, something changed. The classical music, which I thought was drowned out by the TV, began to swell. It wasn't my imagination. It wasn't seeping through the walls or the floor anymore. It poured into the room. A rich, tragic, and horrifying symphony that twisted itself around the game show's jingles. It was like two songs playing from the same speaker, one beautiful and one moronic, creating a third, monstrous harmony that was purely for me. The violins wept, the cellos moaned, and it felt like they were narrating the last moments of my life. Stay or go. My brain, finally kicking back into gear with a jolt of pure, undiluted adrenaline, presented me with the two options. It wasn't even a choice. To stay here was to wait for the window to slide open. To wait for a hand, or a face, or something worse to appear in the gap. To wait for it to step inside my apartment, the apartment I was paying rent for, and do whatever it was that had happened to the girl next door. No, I couldn't stay. But I couldn't stand up either. The moment I stood, my silhouette would fill the curtain. It would know exactly where I was. It would be a target in a shooting gallery. The thought was a lightning bolt. It already knows where you are. The observer under the tree. The scratching on the glass. The patient, methodical work on the lock. This wasn't a random break-in. This was a scheduled appointment. It hadn't been tricked by the TV, it had been drawn by it. The music was the overture, and the TV was the announcement that the audience was seated. And I looked out the window. Days ago I looked out and I saw it. It knew I'd seen it. This wasn't about a random victim anymore. I was a witness. A loose end. My body moved before my mind could argue. I didn't get up. I slid down the wall, my jeans whispering against the plaster. I landed on the floor in a heap and immediately flattened myself, pressing my cheek against the cheap, dusty carpet. My new vantage point was a landscape of furniture legs and dust bunnies. The screaming television was a pulsing god of light and sound somewhere above me. The door. I had to get to the door. It was maybe 15 feet away. It might as well have been a mile. I started to crawl. Not like a baby, but like a soldier under fire. A low, desperate scramble on my elbows and knees. Every movement felt clumsy, loud, the scrape of my jeans on the floor, the soft thud of my knee hitting the ground, the ragged sound of my own breathing. Each noise was a betrayal. I imagined it on the other side of the window, pausing, its head cocked, listening to my pathetic attempt at stealth. The game show was at a commercial break. A jingle for a fast food restaurant filled the air. Cheerful, upbeat. I kept crawling, my eyes locked on the dark rectangle of the front door. My hand brushed against something a little damp. I glanced down. I'd crawled right through a small puddle from where the mini-fridge had leaked. I didn't care. 5 more feet. The symphony from outside got louder still, a crescendo of strings that seemed to press down on the room, suffocating the happy commercial. It was a countdown. I reached the door. I pushed myself up just enough to rest on my knees, my hands flat against the cool, painted wood. My fingers were numb, clumsy sausages that refused to obey. I reached for the deadbolt first. It was my only hope. If I could just get it unlocked without making a sound. My shaking hand closed around the metal knob. It was cold, solid, real. I took a breath, trying to force the air into my constricted lungs, and began to turn it. Slowly, infinitesimally. I could feel the grit and mechanics of the lock grinding against each other. To me, it sounded like a car crash. I expected the music to stop, for the window to fly open behind me. But nothing happened. The dual soundtrack of hell continued its performance. The deadbolt slid back with a soft, greasy thud. My whole body sagged with relief. One more lock, the doorknob. This was harder. It had that little click when the latch disengaged. I wrapped my entire hand around the knob, trying to muffle it, and turned as slowly as I could. My muscles screamed. A bead of sweat dripped from my forehead and hit the back of my hand. I kept turning. The knob reached its limit. Now for the hard part. The pull. I pulled the door inward, just a fraction of an inch at a time, fighting the friction of the frame. A line of blackness appeared. The air from the hallway, stale and smelling faintly of old garbage and something acrid, hit my face. It was the sweetest air I had ever breathed. I didn't open it wide. Just enough to slip through. I got one leg out, then my torso, half crawling, half falling, into the hallway. My body was a mess of uncoordinated limbs. I was almost through. And then I heard it. From inside the room, crack, shot. It was the sound of a window being thrown open with force, the wood frame cracking as it hit its limit, followed by the soft whisper of the cheap curtain being pushed aside. It was in. I didn't wait. I didn't look back. I didn't gently close the door behind me. I scrambled to my feet in the pitch-black hallway, and I ran. My sneakers, which had seemed so silent on the carpet, were now cannons firing on the linoleum floor. Thud. 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 The noise was apocalyptic, in the dead silence of the building. To my left, the door to my apartment was still ajar, spilling that unholy mix of game show cheers and classical music into the hall like a sickness. It was a beacon, and I was running away from it as fast as my legs could carry me. I didn't even think about the elevator. My only thought was the stairwell. The red exit sign at the far end of the hall glowed like the gates of heaven. I slammed into the push bar on the door and stumbled into the concrete stairwell. The door slammed shut behind me, cutting off the sound from my apartment and plunging me into a new kind of hell. An echoing, vertical tomb. My footsteps were the only sound now, a frantic, panicked rhythm that hammered down the concrete flights. Thump, 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 thump. The sound bounced off the walls, coming back at me from above and below, making it sound like I was being chased by a legion of runners. My lungs burned. A stitch was forming in my side. I didn't care. I just kept going down. 6th floor. 5th floor. The air was getting thicker, warmer. 4th floor. I risked a glance over my shoulder at the landings above. Nothing but shadows and concrete. But the echo of my own feet sounded like it was getting closer. 3rd floor. My legs were jelly. I grabbed the cold metal handrail to keep from falling, my palms sliding over its greasy surface as I half ran, half fell down the steps. 2nd floor. Almost there, I could smell the damp, earthy scent of the ground level, of the outside world. The thought of fresh air, of open space, was the only thing propelling me forward. 1st floor. The door was right there. Another push bar, this one leading to freedom. I didn't slow down. I hit it with my full body weight. The door flew open and I burst out into the night. The cold, damp city air hit me like a physical blow. I stumbled onto the sidewalk, my legs giving out from under me. I fell to my hands and knees on the gritty pavement, gasping, coughing, trying to pull the clean, beautiful, exhaust fume-laced air into my tortured lungs. My head was spinning. The world was a blur of hazy streetlights and dark storefronts. I was out. I was alive. I pushed myself up, my back against the brick wall of the building, and looked frantically up and down the empty street. It was deserted. Silent. And then I saw it. Half a block away, drifting slowly towards me, was a pair of headlights. As they got closer, a familiar shape took form. A patrol car. On its roof, a bar of red and blue lights, silent, not yet spinning. It was just there. A routine patrol. A miracle. A sob of pure hysterical relief escaped my throat. I pushed off the wall and stumbled into the street, waving my arms like a madman. "Hey! Stop! Help!" I screamed, my voice cracking. The car slowed, its headlights pinning me in their glare. It pulled up beside me, the passenger window humming down. I could see the silhouette of a cop, his face obscured by the darkness inside the car. I ran to the window, my hands gripping the edge of the door. "Please," I gasped, words tumbling out over each other. "My apartment. Up there. Someone broke in. The window. 6th floor." The officer just looked at me. His expression was calm, patient, maybe a little tired. He looked at my wild eyes, my disheveled clothes, my hands trembling on his car door. And for the first time since that lock snapped, a new kind of cold fear trickled into my veins, a fear completely different from the animal terror of moments before. My mind raced, trying to form a coherent sentence for him, for me, for anyone who would listen. What was I going to say? That it started with a set of rules? That I heard music? That I broke a rule by looking out my window? The relief began to evaporate, replaced by a horrifying, stark realization. I had escaped the box. But standing here, babbling under the indifferent glow of a streetlight, I knew, with sickening certainty, that no one was ever going to believe me. The older officer, Miller, was his name I learned later, didn't even get out of the car. He just leaned over his much younger, antsy-looking partner. His face was a roadmap of long nights and bad coffee, and his eyes, when they looked at me, held a kind of profound weariness that was somehow more frightening than disbelief. "Okay, son," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Stay here, lock the doors, don't get out for any reason, you understand?" I could only nod, my teeth chattering so hard I was afraid I'd chip one. The younger cop, whose name tag read Davis, was already out of the car, hand resting on his sidearm as he scanned the dark facade of my apartment building. A place that, not even a week ago, had seemed like the biggest stroke of luck in my life. Miller got out, said something into the radio on his shoulder, and the two of them walked towards the entrance I had just burst out of. They didn't run. They walked with a calm, deliberate purpose that made my skin crawl. They'd done this before. The car door clicked shut, and I was alone. I fumbled for the lock button and slammed it down. The sound echoed in the small space. I was in the back of a police car. A cage, really. Hard plastic seats that were impossible to get comfortable on. A thick plexiglass divider between me and the front. It smelled of stale coffee, cheap air freshener, and something vaguely like disinfectant. I should have felt safe. It was probably the safest I'd been all night, but all I felt was trapped. I stared out the window at the building. 6th floor. My window. Dark, just like all the others. The unholy symphony of the game show and the classical music had been swallowed by the door Miller and Davis had just disappeared through. It was silent now. The street was silent. It was as if the whole world was holding its breath. What was I going to tell them? The full story? I tried to practice it in my head. So, there's this list of rules the landlord gave me. I broke one. I looked out the window after 11. I saw a guy. Then I started hearing music. And another rule said, if you hear music, you have to blast your TV. I did. But then something started picking the lock on my window. It sounded insane. I sounded insane. They were going to take me to a hospital, not a police station. They'd think I was on something or having a psychotic break. The girl next door, the one who moved away suddenly. Did she tell them about the music? Did anyone even get a chance to ask her? My heart, which had been a jackhammer, was now a slow, heavy drum beating against my ribs. Dread, thick and suffocating, was replacing the adrenaline. The waiting was its own kind of torture. Every second stretched into a minute. I kept my eyes glued to the front door of the building, waiting for it to open. What would come out? The two officers? Or something else? Would I hear a scream? Gunshots? The swell of that goddamn classical music pouring out into the street? I don't know how long I sat there. 10 minutes? 15? It felt like a lifetime. Then, the door creaked open. It was Miller. He was alone. He walked back to the car, his posture exactly the same as when he'd left. Unhurried. Weary, he opened the front driver's side door, glanced back at the building one more time, and then slid into the seat. He didn't start the car. He just sat there for a moment, the silence stretching, my own ragged breathing seeming to fill the entire vehicle. Finally, he turned in his seat, resting an arm on the headrest, and looked at me through the plexiglass. "Your apartment's empty, kid," he said. His voice was flat. "Windows unlocked, curtains pushed to the side. But there's nobody in there, nobody in the hall. Davis is doing a quiet sweep of the stairwells now. He won't find anything." I stared at him. "But I heard it. I heard the lock break. I heard the window open. It was in there with me." Miller sighed. It was the sigh of a man who had heard too many stories and seen too many things he couldn't explain in a report. "I believe you," he said, and those 3 words sent a jolt through me that was colder than any fear I'd felt before. You don't want a cop to believe your crazy story. Because if he believes you, it means it's not crazy, it means it's real. "This ain't the first time we've gotten a call from this building," he continued, his eyes never leaving mine. "Or this block. Usually it's not a 911 call though. Usually it's a wellness check. A missing persons report filed a week later. An unattended death." He said the last 2 words like they were a quote from a form he'd filled out 100 times. My throat was dry. The rules," I managed to croak out. "The list the manager gave me." A flicker of something, not surprise, just grim acknowledgement, passed over Miller's face. "Yeah, the rules." He shook his head slowly. "Let me tell you something about those rules, kid. They weren't from building management. They weren't written by any landlord. Those are a survival guide. Passed down by the poor bastards who've lived here long enough to figure things out." My mind was reeling, trying to connect the dots. Survival from what? Miller leaned a little closer to the divider. "This isn't ghosts or monsters. It's worse. It's people. We think they're a crew, highly organized. They target buildings like this one. Old, a little rundown. Lots of transient tenants who keep to themselves. People nobody will miss for a while." He let that sink in before he continued, his voice dropping even lower, becoming a clinical explanation of a nightmare. "They have a system. One guy's a spotter. He stays outside, across the street, usually. Just watching. He looks for lights turning on and off, figures out who lives alone, learns their schedules. When he picks a target for the night, he gives a signal." My blood ran cold. "The man under the tree. The signal," Miller went on, "is the music. The classical music. It's their go-ahead. It's broadcast on a low-frequency transmitter, so only cheap or old radios and electronics in the immediate vicinity will pick it up. It also serves a second purpose. It helps cover any noise they make, or any noise the victim makes." I felt sick. The music wasn't a warning. It was an announcement. An overture. The girl next door. She'd heard it. But she hadn't done anything. She just disappeared. "So the TV?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "The rule about the TV?" "That's the part the tenants figured out," Miller said, a trace of bleak admiration in his tone. "That's their response. Their defense. It's not about fooling the guys outside. They're not that stupid. It's a signal, sent from one tenant to another. It says, 'I'm awake, I hear you, I know you're out there.' In a way, it's also a signal to the crew themselves. It tells them this one's not an easy target tonight, they're prepared. It's a prayer, kid. A roll of the dice. You're hoping they decide it's not worth the trouble, and will move on to someone else who didn't hear the music, or who thought it was just their neighbor." A horrifying image flashed in my mind. A whole building of terrified people, huddled in their apartments, blasting game shows and sitcoms into the night, each one praying the predators would choose a different door. My God. The man next to the girl's apartment, the one with the quivering lip I'd seen that morning. He knew. They all knew. The way they looked at me, it wasn't pity. It was a kind of weary condemnation. I was the new guy who didn't know the real rules of the game. The gazelle who didn't know how to listen for the lion in the grass. I sagged against the hard plastic seat, the entire world reordering itself in my head into a new, terrifying shape. All the strangeness, all the little quirks of the building, they weren't quirks. They were scars. But why me? The question came out before I could stop it. It was the one piece that didn't fit. They picked me tonight. They came from my window specifically, even with the TV on. Why? Officer Miller was silent for a long time. He just looked at me with those tired, knowing eyes. The streetlights outside seemed to dim. When he finally spoke, his voice was devoid of all emotion, a flat statement of fact that would be burned into my memory forever. You know why they picked you instead of someone else tonight? He asked, his gaze pinning me in place. Because you looked out the window. The spotter saw you that first night, and he knew that you saw him. From that moment on, you weren't a random target anymore, kid. He paused, letting the weight of his words crush me. You were a witness that needed to be silenced.